accumulate over here, just pouring over all kinds of maps, all kinds of changes.
He died to make men holy. Let us die to make men free. While God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. The highest praise is glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
The period between the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of Reconstruction was the only time African Americans had to level the playing field in all areas, including education. The gains made by African Americans during this period were nullified by the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896. One of the most damaging effects of that decision was segregation within education. This proved to have a lingering negative effect on the lives of African Americans until the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka decision in 1954. Not only was segregation within education blatantly racist, it was systematically instituted to preserve white privilege.
Well, if you want to talk about education, you go back to the early period when African Americans were brought to this part of the world as slaves. Many people have the tendency to think that education happens in schools and it involves formal instruction and degrees and grades and so on and so forth. But it's important to remember that there was a lot of education that took place in homes and across tables and in day-to-day experiences. Very rich process of cultural transmission and lessons imparted outside of school. Through most of the 1800s in the South, there were very clear and severe laws against teaching African American slaves to read or to cipher, to use mathematics and so on. Of course, many did. Frederick Douglass is probably the most famous case of a slave that taught himself to read, and of course became a very distinguished figure in American history. But there was a lot of education that occurred in the slave quarters apart from the literacy question. There's a guy named Thomas Weber wrote a wonderful book called Deep Like the Rivers, which is about education in the slave community, and he talks about the values that were transmitted, particularly the very strong valuing of community among Africans, and the sense of their own moral and physical superiority, the disdain which they held for whites, rooted in experiences, comes through very powerfully in slave narratives and recollections of slaves, after the Civil War and so on. So it's important to think about education very broadly as a process of cultural transmission. And of course, it's well known the stories that are passed on through the generations that have African origins. The Uncle Remus tales that were sort of popularized by Disney, those have been shown to have the sort of African origin, the storytelling mode of cultural transmission that is identified with the African American community is thought to be a cultural remnant of West Africa. So that's a big part of the ongoing story of education as an aspect of African American history. Almost from the very beginning, though, and my own research on African Americans in New York City in the 1700s and early 1800s really demonstrates this, that education was always valued very, very highly. The story I like to tell in the 1787, the New York Manumission Society, which was a bunch of very wealthy and powerful white philanthropists in New York City, formed a school, the first non-religiously supported school, which eventually became a part of the New York City public schools. I think if you trace the lineage, it's the oldest part of the New York City public schools, which is kind of interesting. It's a school for African American kids. It was called the New York African Free School, 1787. Now, these philanthropists, when they established this school, they weren't being entirely philanthropic. Their goals were to teach these kids what they felt to be proper behavior. They were responding to what they perceived to be as problems in the African American community of not quite correct behavior and stories about them hanging around with sailors and, you know, playing their musical instruments, you know, late at night, you know, just outrageous behavior in their eyes, you know, like that. So they figured it's very interesting to read their minutes. They get these reports of this what they felt to be bad behavior, and so they resolved to do two things. They established a church and a school, two institutions that they think can impart good behavior. I mean, it's interesting because even in the motion that they used to pass this resolution to establish the school, the language that they use is to teach the children of the African parents the morality and proper behavior so that they do not inherit the vices of their parents. Very interesting language. And the reason I talk about this on a regular basis in my courses, I think it demonstrates as clearly as any incident in American history one of the fundamental purposes of public education, which is the state intervening between parents and children. And it's interesting that this is the first school that eventually becomes the public school system in New York, and it's established for African American kids.
It is clear that race is central to understanding education in this country. At the time of the establishment of the Manumission Society School, a very small minority of African Americans lived in the North. A vast majority lived in the South, and a vast majority of them were slaves, who by law were barred from all forms of formal education.
By 1868, 1869, just a few years after the war has ended, you've got the vast majority of the children of ex-slaves, ex-slave children, in school, learning to read. By 1890, the literacy rate of the African American population in the South has passed 50%. That's just 30 years after slavery, or 25 years after slavery. So it is an absolutely remarkable achievement. Now, of course, the history of Reconstruction is well known. I'm sure you've talked about it on other shows. They have the Great Compromise of the 1870s and the withdrawal of federal troops and the restoration of Southern white supremacy. And for a while, the white supremacists kind of overlook education. But by the 1880s and 1890s, they have cut it back severely so that African American education is getting a lot less support and attention than white education. Lewis Harlan, whose first book, Separate and Unequal, really documents this very dramatically. At the same time that white enrollments and white achievement is going up, black enrollments are, it's interesting. Enrollments, are hang in there. The kids are going to school. But the amount of money that's provided to the schools is cut back severely. In many parts of the South, you have the black schools, which in places like Alabama and Mississippi are educating more kids than the white schools are getting 1/10 the support. And what Harlan documents in many parts of the South is when you look at where the tax base is, it's actually black taxpayers supporting white schools. So there's sort of a negative income transfer going on there. The way this shows up, the most dramatic, and Bob Margo, an economic historian, has also really documented this, is days in the school year. Typically, today the average school year is about 185 days. It was very rare for a school year to be more than 50, 60, 70 days for African Americans in the South. Whereas for whites, it was, still low by national standards, but it was 110, 120 days. So you see, that's some indication of the disparities that existed.
My first 7 years of schooling was in a segregated, all after that was segregated, but was in a one-room schoolhouse where all 8th grade was taught by one teacher. And she got around, believe it or not, to all of us in one day. And our school term was 6 months, where the whites were 9 months. And that was for agricultural reasons, so that we could work in the fields. So our education was cut short. All of our textbooks was always secondhand when we got them. And they used to be riding the bus and we'd be walking, and then they'd pass and use the N-word on us as they would pass. Very, very humiliating.
One of the effects of this enormous inequality. My own research, when I was reading Stephen Gould's book, which is really a fun book, his Mismeasured Man, he made a little note in there about a guy named Ashley Montague, who was an anthropologist who spent his career studying race. Montague was a young anthropologist at Harvard in the 1930s, and he became intrigued by the 1917 Army IQ test, which was the first massive administration of a standardized intelligence test in world history. Basically, a group of Louis Terman and his associates, who had invented this Stanford-Binet IQ test, persuaded the Army to use this as a way of classifying candidates for officer training. So the Army gave this test to over 1 million men in 1917. Well, what they found was just what the racist psychologists predicted, was that native-born white men would score the highest, and that then the European immigrants would score, and then the African Americans, and I think Native Americans were the last group. So of course they attributed this to with biological differences in intelligence, and that of course it was quantitative evidence, right? Who can argue with it? Well, Ashley Montague found a very interesting pattern when he looked at the data. He found that blacks from the north scored higher than whites from the south. So he said, gee, that's interesting. And actually there were some of the psychologists who said, well, that's because all the black the smart blacks moved north. Right, and the dumb whites stayed on south or something like that. But of course, that's not a very compelling answer, is it? Well, I was had a lot of data for this other project I was, and the difference in school years. Getting back to that point, I got the test score data by state level, and from the census in 1900, 1920, and 1910, they have all kinds of data about the number of kids in school, broken down by race, by state, and the length of time they're in school. So I constructed these various factors, variables, to account for the amount of schooling that the black population got in each state versus the white, based on the enrollment levels and the length of the school year. And there's a lot of variation, so I constructed a little series of statistical tests. And what was interesting is that when you plugged in that those factors, the differences in the test scores disappeared. That most of that variation was accounted for by differences in education. And that's what Montague had noticed, but didn't have the statistical wherewithal at that time to really demonstrate. So that's, I think, a kind of a graphic demonstration of how those differences in education got translated into an ideology of superiority and inferiority that the IQ test was used to verify or to legitimate in a very powerful way.
Subtle forms of racism demonstrated by the Army IQ tests were the catalyst for some African American leaders to begin to take a greater role in the education of our people. The establishment of the Tuskegee Institute was Booker T. Washington's attempt to develop a higher level of education for African Americans in the South.
Now, of course, in the South, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were big debates about black education. Booker T. Washington, the Wizard of Tuskegee, as he's been called, was a very prominent national figure. Washington had been a student of Samuel Armstrong and had been sent out to Tuskegee to establish an institution, a manual training institution. He's famous for his speech at the 1896 Atlanta Exposition, where he says that African Americans should, he creates this image of a ship standing in a harbor saying, "Where's the water? We need water." And they shout back, "Throw down your bucket where you are." Right? That's the image he kept saying over in that speech over and over again. "Throw down your bucket where you are." He's saying that to the African American population. You don't need to move. You don't need to agitate for better education or better conditions. Deal with the situation you have now. Do the work that you're being given. Take the status that you're being offered. Don't complain. Work hard, play along, and things will get better. That was his message. And what Washington stood for in the realm of education was manual training. Now, what Jim Anderson and other historians have really demonstrated, I think, very clearly, is that this is an educational approach that was practically void of intellectual content. Those students at Tuskegee barely learned to read. They were given little, if any, of what we would call even a secondary curriculum, as far as reading, writing, mathematical skills, and so on. They went out and worked. They worked in the school sawmill. They worked in the school's dormitories, and they worked in making clothing. They worked in all of these things that Washington imagined would be jobs that they would get out there in the Southern economy. Now, of course, the irony is that those jobs didn't exist. The Tuskegee graduates mainly became teachers in other manual training schools. But the graduates of the manual training schools in the South, African American graduates, by the most part, became servants or manual workers. They didn't, they certainly didn't become managers or, factory foremen or jobs like that because of the white supremacy. It just wasn't going to have them occupy any other positions than the lowest.
And it's amazing how we in the black community want to prop up Marcus Garvey so much, but we degrade Booker T. Washington and call him an Uncle Tom. Now, there are some things Booker T. Washington did that are inexcusable. He didn't speak against lynching. He didn't speak out against Jim Crow. He didn't speak out against the inability of African Americans to be able to register to vote. And some people said he made fun of that. But my opinion is that that was just a survival tactic he did. My opinion of Booker T. Washington was that he said, I'm going to tell these white folks whatever it is they want to hear. If they want to give me money for my school, I'll keep telling them that. But while they're doing that, I'm still running my system. Booker T. Washington's plan was, if you haven't helped this man build this train, what makes you think you have the right to ride on it? His feeling also was, what sense does it make to fight for the right to go into the opera house when you can't afford to get in there anyway? So he was somewhat practical in his approach. But in front of white people, he would tell darky jokes. He would call black people niggers, coons, and stuff like that. But again, I feel that that was just his way of putting white people at ease, because he can't get up there and talk about anything else. And we have to remember, you have to take people where they are. His was a regional message as well. If he had been living in New York City or Boston or Chicago, his message might have been different. But he was standing with 2 feet in the center of Alabama, so he knew what he had to deal with. But privately, although that was Booker T. Washington's public posture to acquiesce to lynching and all that, privately, he financed thousands of court cases to battle Jim Crow. He did it under aliases. He never put his name on it. He had other people do it for him. So Booker T. Washington, a very shrewd man, but I think his message of getting an economic base is very important. Look at the Jewish community. They get whatever they want. And look at American foreign policy. Israel gets so much money, it's disproportionate. But again, they have an economic base, and they've been able to do things with it. And you see the Asians coming in now, and also these Indians, these immigrants coming from India, they have an economic base, so they're getting their message heard. So I think maybe if we had to do it over again, we will be just as vigorous with our economic platform as we were with the civil rights platform. So I think that's what Booker T. Washington's legacy probably is. And some people criticize him for his school, Tuskegee, but they said that the curriculum, again, taught women how to clean the house, how to be good domestics, how to cook, and it taught the men how to chop wood and do masonry. But he said this is something that we dominate, that we excelled at during slavery. Let's perfect it now. And now, if you notice, year 2000, you have many white companies now. These are made companies now, going around to these wealthy homes and making a lot of sums of money. And that's something that the black community has ran away from. So I think Booker T. Washington gets a lot of criticism from educated black folk. But I think he was just trying to deal with his people where they were. And let's take what we've been good at and master that. He didn't think anything wrong. Booker T. Washington didn't think there was anything wrong with shining shoes. He said, you be the best shoe shiner you can, you'll make some money. But as black folks began to get educated, we began to look down on some of those activities and trade.
Booker T. Washington by far becomes the most prominent black leader with the early part of the 20th century. There's no question about it. We can still debate when he was born. Some will say 1887, some say a year too early, a year too late, etc., because he was born in slavery in Virginia. He goes on to eke out an education at Hampton University in Hampton, Virginia, studying under Samuel Chapman Armstrong in the industrial schooling philosophy and idea. He leaves Hampton and founds Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama in 1881. Today, Tuskegee, of course, is a major university. Washington's philosophy was one of uplift, but I would argue it was one of uplift through submission. let me explain that when I say uplift through submission, because people have a number of different labels they'll put on Washington. They'll call him the great accommodator. They'll call him the wizard of Tuskegee. And all the rest. And others will say that, no, he just simply compromised, he sold us downriver. And others say, no, he was a shrewd politician, etc. As I understand Washington's philosophy, if I can put it this way, when I say one who believed in uplift through submission, Washington argued this. He said, look, the reality is whites are in power. Now, how do we survive? And in fact, how do we rise up in the situation we're in? Remember, he's in Tuskegee, Alabama, in the heart of Dixie in the late 19th, early 20th century. How do we survive this? How do we make good in this situation? And he would argue to black folks, do you do that by trying to assert your right to vote, which now, of course, we have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments? Or do you do that by, in fact, accepting whatever job you can get? And Washington said in speeches, in his most famous speech, the Atlanta Exposition Address in 1895, he tells the South, white and black, that on all issues, we can be as separate as the fingers. On economic matters, we'll be like the hand and work together. But when it comes to social matters, we'll be separate, etc. And for black folks, he would argue, look, take any job. A job paying you 50 cents a day, while a white man may make $1 a day. That 50 cents a day is better than no job at all. And when he would be asked by people, well, what about the right to vote? He would say it's much more important to own your home than the right to vote. Others would say, well, we want to be served in restaurants. Washington would say, well, most of my race can't even afford to go and dine in restaurants. But we can't be accommodated in hotels, where very few of my race actually use or need a hotel. And it was that kind of philosophy. But at the same time, in all fairness to Washington, he saw that as a way of gaining power. In fact, when I read through the Booker T. Washington papers at the Library of Congress, and still to this day, they're one of the most used and utilized collections in the whole Library of Congress. And what you find Washington outlining there is his belief of how black folks can achieve power this way. And he would say to you, look, you take that 50 cent a day job and you work from there to the point, as Washington put it, where you can own the white man's house. And that white man will have to come to you for the mortgage, etc. Where you can own your own land. You make your own institutions. So it was within that, that's why I say a philosophy of, in a sense, uplift through submission. The goal being, the belief being, you will have to take what it's given and make do with that and rise up from that.